Hi and welcome to our channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the beginnings of behavioral economics. In this video, I take the work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman together, and where appropriate, individually and with other contributors, in chronological order, to help digest the evolution of the discipline. In their first joint work, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman laid the foundations for correcting psychological intuitions based on statistical proofs in belief in the law of small numbers. Their observations show that biases caused by intuitions are present in the everyday lives of both ordinary people and scientists and can affect the outcome of many research studies if they give in to their subjective opinions. The first such intuitive bias they have observed is the belief in the representativeness of small samples, which they have avoided by relying on statistical evidence as opposed to subjective judgments, which has caused considerable difficulties for many researchers but can significantly reduce the number of erroneous conclusions, thus contributing to the reliability and relevance of research. It is recommended that after using any experiment, questionnaire survey, or research methodology, the data obtained should be validated by statistical calculation according to the methodology and the results evaluated, rather than relying on intuition. The gambler's fallacy is a good representation of the representativeness of small item samples, since in a bivariate game, if the game yields the same result in succession, the player's expectations are subject to a counterfactual, that subsequent outcomes will occur with different outputs, so that the outputs eventually form a representative sequence, confirming that the small item pattern is assumed to be equivalently representative to the large item pattern. In their paper, they presented the findings of Cohen, who has investigated statistical fallacies in several studies in the behavioral sciences and social psychology. Overall, the result of his study was the suggestion that the statistical reliability of the research results is inadequate and that further statistical measurements are needed. Through their non-representative survey and relevant literature review, Tversky and Kahneman found that intuition bias is not only present in the behavior of ordinary people, but also in the behavior of statistically trained researchers. By examining the representativeness of samples, they found that people measure the probability of certain samples to a predetermined subjective representativeness, which is usually wrong since the probability cannot be predicted from the sample since it is not representative of the population. Further scientific work has been devoted to the study of intuitive biases such as these. In their paper Subjective Probability, a Judgment of Representativeness, they used experiments and the already criticized statistically reliable sample size to investigate the biases of individuals due to representativeness. The basic assumption was that individuals expect many multitudes to be representative even in small samples, what Kahneman and Tversky called local representativeness. This hypothesis was tested in 3 experiments, with subjects rejecting situations that violated the belief in local representativeness, or the law of small numbers, thus proving the hypothesis. Toon and Wagenaar, when they wanted to reconstruct random processes, found that individuals accepted as random only those samples that were judged to be locally representative. Overall, subjects perceived that the locally representative samples were more likely to be representative of reality. Further experiments were conducted to investigate the probabilities of representativeness, concluding that subjects did not have a clear preference for the more likely options, and thus for them, the difference in relevance between small and large samples seemed almost indistinguishable. Based on a Bayesian model of individuals' posterior probability judgments, Edwards found that individuals are conservative Bayesian estimators, with some bias, false aggregation effect detection, and incorrect findings. This finding was tested in 3 experiments, in which subjects were asked to make posterior estimates of the sample content, binomial, whether there were more blue or red balls in the 2 bags. Based on individuals' estimates, people are not Bayesian estimators at all, as they use the sample proportions incorrectly in their judgments. The next point in the research on heuristics was the work Availability, a heuristic for judging frequency and probability, which examined a more common bias that is frequently experienced in everyday life, which is the availability heuristic. It was thought that individuals judge events to be more frequent if they can remember or recall them more easily or assign a higher probability to these events occurring. They conducted their research by designing 10 studies, for which data were obtained from around 1,500 participants. First, they established the accessibility of individuals' ability to estimate the number of items and time intervals within which they can recall each word, showing that people can estimate the number of items they can recall from their background memory at each time relatively accurately. In contrast, when asked to construct words according to given parameters, a different result can be expected, and in their experiments, they found that, given some difficulty, such as recalling words in which the letter K occupies the first or third position in the word, individuals give a quick, intuitive estimate in favor of the more easily recalled scenario. In cases where they did not have to rely on pre-existing knowledge, but had to draw inferences based on, for example, heard audio material, the results of the experiment showed that when names were played, male-female in a 50-50 split, the group with the name of a celebrity was judged to be the larger, as they were easier to remember and tended to overestimate it. In their study, they mention the work of Hopkins, Boylan, and Lincoln, in which they showed that subjects remembered better and perceived what they heard more often, according to the degree of articulation. Thus, according to these two findings, individuals tend to overestimate events that they remember better and recall more easily, or judge the likelihood and frequency of an event occurring according to their level of representativeness. In their paper on the psychology of prediction, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky summarize previous work on how prior information can affect the probability of an event occurring and the extent to which it affects the probability as judged by representativeness. In their study, respondents were given a person specification of a fictitious person to guess which of the given majors they would study. The results showed that the person specification, whose information could be overlaid on certain majors, misled subjects about the prior probability number of majors, so that they assigned probabilities to the person's study of certain majors based on the representativeness of the person specification. A person specification that did not provide any representative information for the distribution of majors did not cause bias, and the ranking was based on the actual number of majors-based probabilities. In further experiments, given prior information asking for predictions, 3 groups of subjects were given 3 different pieces of information related to study trends, from which they had to guess the study average of 10 individuals, according to their expectations. With less or no reliable information, subjects did not regress their estimates on the future, or not to the extent expected, which would have contributed to estimating the true value. They found that regression was not considered at all or only to a small extent in the tests, and as proof of this, in a further experiment in which a person was given an intelligence quotient of 140, which is the sum of the true value and a random value, respondents were asked to give the true intelligence quotient, which could be varied upwards or downwards. Even though the average intelligence quotient of the population is significantly lower than the given value, in this case, this would be the expected result. 67.6% of the respondents did not regress or barely regressed, 22.2% regressed downwards and 10.2% regressed upwards, which essentially means that they ignored the baseline value, i.e., they worked with the input information and thus arrived at incorrect findings, biased. The first phase of the study of cognitive biases arising from uncertainty in individuals ended with the publication of Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases in 1974, which summarized the studies of the preceding 3 years in a more accessible form. Its contents are essentially the main observations, with some additions such as the concept of anchoring, which will result in a bias of the post-estimate estimate of prior information to the primary information. Individuals, like a ship to an anchor, will have little or no difficulty in moving away from what is irrelevant information to make the correct response. Thanks for watching today's video on behavioral economics. We hope you found it informative and that you learned something new. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more financial tips and insights.